already know how Caligula died. 30 stab wounds in a stone tunnel. His own bodyguards too late to save him. His last words, "I am still alive," ignored by every man holding a blade. That is where every documentary ends. Credits roll. Case closed. The monster is dead. Rome is saved. Except Rome was not saved. Within the hour, his wife was stabbed through the throat by a tribune who could not look her in the eye while he did it. His 18-month-old daughter was picked up by a soldier and had her skull smashed against a wall. 3 words of Latin, parieti, inlisa. That was the official record of a baby's murder. And that was still not the end. Because what happened next, what the Senate voted to do to his name, his face, his memory, what the Praetorian Guard did to the Roman Republic in a single night, and what a lead pipe buried in a garden kept hidden for 2,000 years, is the story nobody has ever told you. Until now. If this is your first time on this channel and you have not seen part 1, which covers his entire life from birth to assassination, the link is in the comments. Go watch that first, then come back. For everyone else, you know exactly where we left off. A body in a tunnel, a baby against a wall, and an empire that was about to tear itself apart over what to do next. Before we go any further, if you watched part 1 and came back for this, you are exactly who we built this channel for. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because what you are about to hear is the half of the Caligula story that nobody tells. The killing was not the end, it was the beginning, and I promise you, what comes next is worse. The emperor was dead, but the killing had not stopped. To understand what happened in the hours after the assassination, you need to understand a group of men that every telling of this story either ignores or dismisses as savages. The Germani, Corporis Custodes, Caligula's Germanic bodyguard. They were not Roman. That was the point. Every emperor since Augustus had kept a personal guard of foreign warriors, men with no ties to Roman politics, no loyalty to the Senate, no reason to participate in Roman conspiracies. Caligula's unit was drawn from the Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine, the same frontier where his father Germanicus had campaigned, the same camps where a toddler in tiny boots had once been their mascot. These men did not serve Rome. They served the emperor, personally. And when word reached them that the emperor was dead, they did not grieve quietly. They went through the palace and the theater complex with drawn swords, and they killed anyone they suspected of involvement. The historian Josephus, whose account of these hours is the most detailed we have, names 3 senators who died in the rampage: Asprenas, Norbanus, Balbus, Antaeus. Asprenas was killed first. His head was separated from his body and carried through the corridors. Norbanus fell next. Then Antaeus. Their severed heads were brought to the theater and placed on the altar, the same altar where sacrificial animals had burned that morning during the flamingo ceremony that sprinkled blood on the emperor's toga. The bodyguards made their own offering, human heads where animal heads had been. The audience inside the theater could not leave. The exits were blocked. Nobody knew what was happening. Rumors moved through the seats like fire. Caligula was dead. No, Caligula was alive, and this was a loyalty test. No, the Praetorians had turned on the Senate. No, the bodyguards were killing everyone. In the middle of that panic, a senator named Valerius Asiaticus climbed onto something, a seat, a stage block, some elevated surface, and shouted to the crowd. Josephus preserves the words, "I wish I had been the man." 5 words, spoken in a theater full of terrified people, with Germanic bodyguards carrying severed heads through the aisles, while the emperor's blood was still wet on the tunnel floor 30 meters away. It was the most dangerous sentence spoken in Rome that day. It was also, from the perspective of a senator, who had spent years enduring Caligula's reign, the most honest. The bodyguards did not rampage because they were savages. They rampaged because they were grieving. That was the part Rome never wanted to admit, that someone loved him. Now, while the bodyguards were rampaging through the theater, a separate operation was underway. The conspirators had planned this. The assassination in the tunnel was only the first step. The second step was the elimination of the bloodline. A tribune named Julius Lupus was dispatched to the palace. His orders were not to arrest. His orders were to finish what had been started in the Cryptoporticus. Because the conspirators understood a principle that every political assassin in history has understood, from the Ides of March to the Russian Revolution. You do not just kill the leader, you kill the family. Because if any heir survives, any child, any spouse, any relative, with a claim to the throne, that person becomes the center of a future counter-revolution. Blood remembers. Blood always remembers. Lupus found Caesonia in the corridor near the body. Melonia Caesonia, the fourth wife, the woman who was neither young nor beautiful, and whom Caligula had loved with what Suetonius calls passionate faithfulness. The woman whose neck he used to kiss while whispering that he could remove her beautiful head whenever he chose. She was kneeling beside the corpse of her husband. She was cursing him. The sources do not tell us what she was saying, only that it was directed at the dead man at her feet. Perhaps she was cursing him for not listening to her warnings. Josephus records that she had begged him to take the threat seriously. Perhaps she was cursing him for the life he had built for her, which she now understood had always been leading to this floor, this blood, this moment. Perhaps the curse was the kind that only makes sense between two people who have shared a bed and a world, and now share nothing. She saw Lupus. She understood immediately. And Caesonia did something that Josephus records with a specificity that suggests it was reported by someone who was in the room. She bared her throat. She did not beg. She did not run. She did not scream or bargain or collapse. She looked at the man who had come to kill her, and she offered him the target. Lupus hesitated. He was a tribune, a military officer. Killing a defenseless woman in a corridor was not what tribunes were trained for, but the orders were clear, and the logic behind them was undeniable. If Caesonia survived, she became a symbol. If she survived with the baby became a future claimant. The bloodline had to end. He ran her through with his sword. Then there was the baby. Julia Drusilla, 18 months old, named after the only person Caligula may have ever loved, his sister Drusilla, whom he had deified as the all-goddess Panthea after her death. The child he had carried to every temple in Rome and placed in the laps of the divine statues. The child whose violent temper she scratched the faces of the other children she played with, Caligula had cited as proof that she was truly his daughter. A soldier, the sources do not record his name. Only his action picked up the child and smashed her head against a wall. Parieti, inlisa. Dashed against a wall. 3 words of Latin to record the destruction of an 18-month-old life. She was the last direct descendant of Caligula. With her death, his bloodline was severed completely. No child, no heir, no future claim. The conspirators had accomplished what they set out to do. They had not merely killed an emperor, they had erased a family line from the biological future of Rome. An 18-month-old child was murdered for the crime of having the wrong father. Her name was Julia Drusilla. She was named after the only person Caligula ever loved. Nobody in 2,000 years has built her a monument, and here is what the histories of this event almost never mention. There was mourning. Not in the Senate. The Senate celebrated. Every senator who had spent 3 years living under the daily threat of execution, who had forced himself to laugh at the emperor's jokes and prostrate himself before a man in a golden beard and women's clothing, who had watched colleagues dragged from the chamber and never seen again, every one of them breathed out when the news arrived. But the The common people of Rome, the women and children and slaves and freedmen and soldiers who had lived under Caligula's rule in a different way than the Senate, had they mourned. Josephus records it, and he records it reluctantly, because Josephus was writing for an audience of educated Greek-speaking Romans who did not want to hear that the lower orders had loved a tyrant. But the record is there. The people valued his distributions of money and grain. They valued his games and spectacles, which were more lavish than any emperor before him. They valued something specific that no other historian bothers to mention, but that Josephus understood mattered. Caligula had given slaves the legal right to bring accusations against cruel masters. Think about what that meant. In a society where a slave was legally a piece of furniture, where a master could beat, starve, rape, or kill his property with no consequence, one emperor, the Senate, called a monster, had opened a door. A slave could walk into a court and point at the man who owned him and say, "This man is cruel." It was not freedom. It was not even close to freedom, but it was a crack in the wall, and the people who lived on the wrong side of that wall remembered it. The sources tell us that 160,000 animals had been sacrificed when Caligula took power, that the people had called him star and chick and baby and nursling. Those same people did not simply forget. The Germanic bodyguards' rampage was extreme, yes, but it was also an expression of something the Senate wanted to pretend did not exist. Grief, real grief, from people whose emperor had just been butchered in a tunnel while they sat in a theater watching plays. Rome's historians wrote for the Senate. The Senate wanted Caligula erased, but the people who cooked his meals and swept his floors and polished his boots, they lit candles for him. And nobody recorded their names. While the bodyguards raged and the blood dried in the Cryptoporticus, the consuls of Rome saw an opportunity that the Roman Senate had not had in 80 years. The emperor was dead. His heir was dead. His wife was dead. His baby was dead. For the first time since Augustus had ended the Republic in 27 BC, there was no designated successor. No one standing in line. No name written in a will. No. The position was open. And the two sitting consuls, Gnaeus Sentius Saturninus and Quintus Pomponius Secundus, looked at that vacancy and saw something that made their hearts race. They saw a chance to bring back the Republic. The Senate was convened on the Capitoline Hill, not in their usual meeting house, but on the sacred height of Rome, beside the Temple of Jupiter, in a deliberate echo of the old Republic's greatest moments. The symbolism was unmistakable. This was not a routine session. This was the Senate of Rome, reclaiming its ancient authority. Saturninus spoke first. Josephus preserved portions of the speech, and it is one of the most extraordinary documents of failed hope in Roman history. "We are now in possession of liberty," Saturninus told the chamber. Liberty. The word hung in the air of a building where, for the previous 3 years, saying the wrong word had been a death sentence. Saturninus argued for the restoration of democratic government. He argued that the tyranny of Caligula proved what the tyranny of Tiberius had already suggested, that concentrating absolute power in a single man was a system designed to produce monsters. He argued that the Roman people were capable of governing themselves, that the Senate was capable of leading, that the experiment of monarchy had failed, and it was time to return to the constitutional order that had made Rome great. It was a beautiful speech. It was also, within 12 hours, completely irrelevant. Because even as Saturninus spoke, someone noticed something. A senator named Trebellius Maximus looked at the consul's hand and saw that Saturninus was still wearing a signet ring bearing the image of Caligula. The man delivering the speech about liberty was wearing the dead tyrant's face on his finger. Trebellius walked up and broke the ring off his hand. It was the first act of erasure. It happened within hours of the death, and it was performed not by a decree of the Senate, but by one man who noticed a contradiction and could not tolerate it. The debate continued through the night. Senators argued. Names were proposed as potential leaders. Marcus Vinicius, a senator married to Julia Livilla, Caligula's surviving sister, was put forward as a candidate for emperor. But Vinicius lacked direct Julio-Claudian blood. He had married into the dynasty. He was not born of it. And in Rome, that distinction was the difference between legitimacy and ambition. Other names surfaced and sank. The debate was passionate. It was eloquent. It was erudite. And while it went on, while the greatest deliberative body in the ancient world argued about the future of civilization by torchlight on the Capitoline Hill, something was happening on the other side of the city that would make every word they spoke meaningless. The Senate spent the night arguing about democracy. The Praetorians spent the night counting swords. In Rome, swords always won. While the Senate debated on the hill, a soldier named Gratus was searching the imperial palace. The palace was enormous. The Palatine complex sprawled across the entire hilltop dining halls, reception chambers, private apartments, servants' quarters, gardens, temples. Caligula had extended it personally, pushing it into the forum, connecting it to the temple of Jupiter with a bridge. In the chaos following the assassination, soldiers and freedmen and servants were moving through this labyrinth in every direction, some looting, some hiding, some searching for survivors, some simply running. Gratus was searching, and in a room that Josephus calls the Hermaeum, a small private apartment or alcove, possibly a corridor leading to a terrace, Gratus noticed something. A pair of feet protruding from beneath a curtain. He pulled the curtain aside. The man behind it fell to his knees. His legs were shaking so badly he could not stand. He began begging for his life immediately, before Gratus had said a word, before he even knew who had found him or what they intended. He was 50 years old, and he looked every year of it. He walked with a limp. He stuttered when he spoke. His own family had treated him as a humiliation for his entire life. His mother, Antonia, had called him a monster whom nature had started but not finished. Caligula had kept him alive primarily as a source of entertainment, a fool at the imperial dinner table, the uncle everyone laughed at. His name was Tiberius Claudius Nero Germanicus, and the soldier who found him did not kill him. Gratus looked at the trembling man on the floor and said something that Josephus records with the precision of someone who understood it was a world historical moment. "Sir, give up these small thoughts about saving yourself when you should be thinking higher thoughts about taking over the empire." The soldier was not being clever, he was being practical. Because Gratus understood something that the Senate, in their eloquent all-night debate about liberty and republican government, had not grasped. The Praetorian Guard needed an emperor, not wanted, needed. Without an emperor, the Praetorian Guard had no function. They were the imperial bodyguard. If there was no emperor, there was nothing to guard. If the Republic returned, the Guard would be disbanded or downgraded to a regular military unit. Their privileged position, their elevated pay, their political influence, their barracks in the center of Rome, all of it depended on the continuation of one-man rule. And the man on the floor behind the curtain was the last surviving adult male member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Claudius was carried to the Praetorian camp in a covered litter. His legs would not support him. The route from the palace to the camp crossed through public streets, and the citizens of Rome who saw the procession pass assumed they were watching a man being taken to his execution. Josephus records that they pitied him. He was not being taken to his execution. He was being taken to his coronation. Now here's the part of this story that every documentary skims past and that changes everything if you understand it. Why Claudius? Why this man, specifically? Why not any of the senators being discussed on the Capitoline? Why not a general? Why not Vinicius, who was married to a Julio-Claudian woman? Because blood. Only blood. Claudius was the son of Nero Claudius Drusus, the brother of Germanicus, the nephew of the Emperor Tiberius, and the great-nephew of the divine Augustus. He carried the bloodline of every legitimate ruler Rome had known since the Republic ended. His body was broken, his speech was impaired, his dignity was non-existent. But his DNA, to use the modern term for something the Romans understood in their own way, was impeccable. And in a system where legitimacy flowed through family and family alone, that was the only thing that mattered. And then came the price. In the Praetorian camp, surrounded by the men who now controlled his fate and the fate of the empire, Claudius made a promise. Every Praetorian guardsman would receive a donative, a cash payment of 15,000 sesterces. Some sources say 20,000. Let me translate that into terms that make it real. A Roman legionary soldier earned approximately 900 sesterces per year. A Praetorian guardsman earned more, roughly 1,000 to 1,200. Claudius was offering each man between 12 and 22 years of salary in a single payment, in cash. The Praetorian Guard at this time numbered roughly 9,000 men. Multiply 9,000 by 15,000 sesterces, and you arrive at a figure of approximately 135 million sesterces. That was the price of the Roman Empire on the night of January 24th in the year 41. The historian Suetonius, writing 80 years later, recorded a judgment about this moment that should be carved into the wall of every political science department in the world. He was the first Caesar to purchase the loyalty of his troops with money. The first. Not the last, the first. And once that precedent was set, it could never be undone. Because every subsequent emperor now knew that the Praetorian Guard expected payment for loyalty, and every Praetorian guardsman now knew that their loyalty was a commodity with a market price. In the year 69, 28 years after this night, 4 different men would claim the throne in a single year, the year of the 4 emperors, each one bidding for military support with larger and larger payments. In the year 193, a senator named Didius Julianus would stand outside the Praetorian barracks and literally auction the Roman Empire, bidding against a rival, while the guards stood on the walls and shouted the bids back and forth, like auctioneers at a livestock sale. He won. He paid 25,000 sesterces per man. He lasted 66 days before the next army arrived and killed him. That auction, the most infamous moment in Roman political history, the moment the empire was sold, like a house at a foreclosure, traces directly back to this night, to this camp, to a stammering, limping, terrified man who had been found behind a curtain and carried to a barracks and told that the price of survival was 135 million sesterces. The Roman Republic died, for the final time, not with a sword, but with a money bag. The Praetorians proved what every dictator since has learned. Whoever controls the military controls the world. And the military can be rented. There was one more figure in this drama who deserves his moment. Herod Agrippa I, king of Judea, a childhood friend of Claudius who happened to be in Rome for the Palatine Games. While the Senate debated on the hill and the Praetorians hailed their new emperor in the camp, Agrippa served as an intermediary. He carried messages between the two sides. He talked the Senate down from their republican fantasies. He talked the Praetorians down from storming the Capitol. He navigated between 2 armed camps with the skill of a man who had spent his entire life surviving at the edges of empires. By the morning of January 25th, it was over. The urban cohorts, the city garrison that had initially sided with the Senate, deserted to the Praetorians. The senators looked around the Capitol line and realized they were alone. No troops, no leverage, no power except the power of their own eloquence, which turned out to be worth exactly nothing when measured against 9,000 swords and a chest full of money. The Senate capitulated. Claudius was emperor. The Republic had been dead for 80 years. It stayed dead. And the debate that had lasted all night, the speeches about liberty and self-governance and the rights of the Roman people, those survived only because Josephus thought they were interesting enough to preserve. The men who gave them went home and served the new emperor, because that was what Roman senators did. They survived. It was what they were best at. Now, Claudius had a problem. The men who had killed Caligula were, by any reasonable assessment, heroes. They had freed Rome from a tyrant. The Senate had cheered when the news arrived. The people had celebrated, at least the parts of the people that the historians cared about had celebrated. Chaerea, Sabinus, Lupus, and the other conspirators had risked their lives to remove a man who had cut out tongues, fed spectators to beasts, and forced a boy to find the mortal spot on his own body with a sword. Claudius executed them. Not immediately, and not without calculation. The historian Dio Cassius provides the analysis that explains everything about this decision, and it has nothing to do with Caligula and everything to do with Claudius. Claudius did not execute the conspirators to avenge his nephew. Claudius had hated his nephew. Caligula had spent years humiliating him at dinner, using him as a punchline, once reportedly dumping food on his head while the court laughed. Claudius did not care that Caligula was dead. What Claudius cared about was the precedent. If the men who killed one emperor went unpunished, then any man with a sword and a grievance had permission to kill the next emperor, including this emperor, including the man who had been found behind a curtain. Cassius Chaerea was brought before Claudius, the man who had saved Germanicus on the Rhine, the man who had endured daily humiliation, the watchwords Priapus and Venus, the obscene hand gesture, being called a wench in front of his own officers, the man who had stood in that tunnel and cried hawk age as the blade came down. Chaerea was sentenced to death. He made one request. He asked to be executed with his own sword. The sword that had killed the emperor. Claudius granted it. And after the execution, something happened that tells you more about Roman public opinion than any Senate speech. The Roman people made offerings to Chaerea's departed spirit. They honored his manes, the shade of the dead, the ghost with the kind of ritual devotion normally reserved for ancestors and heroes. The man who killed the tyrant was executed by the new tyrant and then worshipped by the people, hero and criminal, liberator and condemned man, both things simultaneously, in a city that had perfected the art of holding contradictions. Cornelius Sabinus, the tribune who had struck one of the first blows in the tunnel, he was permitted to take his own life after watching Chaerea die. He chose not to survive his friend. Julius Lupus, the man who had killed Caesonia and the baby, was executed. The centurions who had participated were executed. The machinery of imperial justice processed them efficiently and without sentiment. And then there was Callistus. The freedman Callistus had been one of the conspirators. He had fed intelligence about Caligula's movements to the plotters. He had helped coordinate the assassination. He had been part of the machinery that put the emperor in the cryptoporticus at the right moment. Callistus was not executed. Callistus was promoted. He became Claudius's secretary, a libellus, the controller of petitions, one of the most powerful administrative positions in the empire. He had the new emperor's ear. He had access to the imperial schedule, the imperial correspondence, the names and cases of every person who sought the emperor's favor. The man who had helped kill one emperor was now running the office of the next. His survival strategy was elegant. He claimed, and nobody could disprove it, that during Caligula's reign, Caligula had ordered him to poison Claudius. Callistus claimed that he had deliberately delayed and obstructed that order, saving Claudius's life without Claudius knowing. Whether it was true or an invention tailored perfectly to the new reality, the result was the same. Callistus walked through the transition untouched and emerged on the other side more powerful than before. There is a lesson in that. Revolutions devour the people who start them. That is the rule. But they do not devour the people who manage the paperwork. The swordsmen die. The administrators survive. Chaerea swung the blade and got a funeral pyre. Callistus held the scroll and got a promotion. Claudius understood something the Senate never did. The assassins did not threaten Caligula's legacy. They threatened every emperor who came after, including the one hiding behind the curtain. If you have made it this far, you are not a casual viewer. You are exactly who this channel was built for. We do not rush through history. We do not simplify it. We do not soften it. If you want to make sure you never miss what we put out, subscribe right now. And if you want to support the work directly, so we can keep producing documentaries at this level, check the membership options below this video. Now, what Rome did to the dead man's name. The Romans had a punishment worse than death. They could kill you and then kill the fact that you had ever existed. Modern scholars call it damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. The Romans themselves did not use that phrase. They simply did it. A vote, a decree. And then the work began. Your name was chiseled from every inscription on every public building in the empire. Your face was cut from every statue. Your image was scraped from every coin. Your buildings were demolished. Your laws were annulled. Your name was removed from the calendar, from the oaths, from the records. You were deleted. Not from history, they could not control what people remembered in their homes, but from the physical fabric of the Roman state. Every surface that had carried your name was made to carry nothing, a void where a person had been. When Caligula was murdered on January the 24th, the Senate moved immediately to inflict exactly this punishment. And then Claudius stopped them. The historian Dio records this at chapter 60, book 4. Claudius prevented a formal Senate decree condemning Caligula's memory. Not out of love for his dead nephew. Claudius had no love for the man who had poured food on his head and made him the butt of every court joke. He blocked it for a reason that had nothing to do with Caligula and everything to do with himself. Claudius's entire claim to the throne rested on one fact. He was a member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. He was the legitimate heir because he shared blood with Augustus, with Tiberius, with Germanicus, and yes, with Caligula. If the Senate formally condemned Caligula's memory, they established that the Senate had the authority to condemn an emperor. And if the Senate could condemn a dead emperor, they could condemn a living one. Claudius was not going to hand them that weapon. What followed instead was something stranger and more revealing than a clean decree of condemnation. A quiet, unofficial, deliberately contradictory campaign of erasure. Erase, but do not formally erase. Remove, but leave enough traces to maintain the dynasty's legitimacy. Pretend he never existed, but do not put the pretending in writing. Claudius wanted Caligula forgotten, but not officially forgotten, because officially forgotten meant the Senate had power, and Claudius was never giving the Senate power again. The statues went first. In the decades since Caligula's reign, archaeologists and art historians have tracked what happened to his portraits with the kind of forensic precision that the Romans themselves would have appreciated. The scholar Eric Varner cataloged the evidence. At least 18 portrait statues of Caligula were located, seized, and recarved into portraits of Claudius. 12 or more were recarved as Augustus. Think about what recarving means. A sculptor takes a marble portrait, Caligula's hollow cheeks, his high forehead, his gaunt features, and cuts into it. The chisel reshapes the jawline. New features emerge from the old stone. Claudius's weaker chin emerges from Caligula's stronger one. Augustus's serene expression replaces the face that had practiced terror in a mirror on Capri. The marble remembers both faces, the new one on the surface, the old one underneath, visible to anyone who knows where to look, in the proportions that do not quite match. In the forehead that is slightly too high for the chin below it, in the ears that sit at the wrong angle for the face they now frame. Other statues were simply mutilated. Noses smashed, eyes gouged, ears broken. The disfigurement was deliberate and personal, the same treatment given to the faces of the hated dead in cultures across the ancient world. And then they were thrown into the Tiber. The river that ran through the heart of Rome became a dumping ground for the stone faces of a dead emperor. But not all of them. That is the part that matters. In Richmond, Virginia, of all places, there sits a marble statue known as the Richmond Togatus. It survived, intact. Caligula's face, uncut, unmodified, staring into a museum with the same expression he practiced on Capri. In Gortyna, on the island of Crete, another portrait survived, untouched. Either the decree never reached that far, or the local official charged with destroying it chose not to, or the statue was simply missed in the chaos of the transition. The erasure was not systematic. It was not thorough. It was, in many ways, a performance vigorous at the center and increasingly half-hearted as you move toward the edges of the empire. Then the coins. In the year 43, Claudius issued a decree ordering all bronze coinage bearing Caligula's portrait to be recalled and melted down. Dio records what happened to the metal. It was recast into statues of Nestor. Nestor was a pantomime actor. He was also the lover of Claudius's wife, Messalina. Think about that sequence. Caligula's face on a coin, melted, recast as the face of the man sleeping with the new emperor's wife. The irony is so precise, it almost feels intentional. One emperor's vanity transformed into another emperor's humiliation, with molten bronze as the medium. Many coins were not melted but countermarked a small stamp, usually the letters Tica for Tiberius Claudius Augustus, punched over Caligula's face. Claudius's name literally stamped on top of Caligula's portrait, not destroying it, covering it, claiming it. And yet, hundreds of Caligula's coins survived. They survive today, in museums, in private collections, in archaeological deposits across 3 continents. Caligula's portrait exists on more surviving coins than some emperors who reigned for decades and were never subjected to a recall. The decree to melt them was issued. The melting was attempted. And the coins outlasted the decree, the melting, the emperor who issued it, and the empire that created all of them. The inscriptions were worse. Or rather, the inscriptions were more revealing, because the inconsistency tells you everything. In Pompeii, the city preserved by Vesuvius, like a photograph of Roman life, 2 inscriptions from Caligula's reign have survived. CIL 1903 was erased, the name chiseled out, the stone left, scarred. CIL Dine 902, in the same city, from the same period, was left intact. Same city, same era. 2 monuments, one erased, one not. Either the team charged with the erasure ran out of enthusiasm halfway through the job, or they were given contradictory orders, or they simply could not be bothered to walk to the other side of Pompeii. The incompleteness is the evidence. The erasure was never meant to be total. It was meant to be visible. Rome did not need Caligula's name to actually disappear. Rome needed to be seen trying to make it disappear. The gesture mattered more than the result. The buildings told the same story of selective destruction. The bridge connecting the Palatine Palace to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, the bridge Caligula had built so he could visit his fellow god whenever he wished, was torn down. The temples where he had been worshipped as a living deity were dismantled. And then there were the ships. On Lake Nemi, in the Alban Hills south of Rome, Caligula had built 2 enormous pleasure barges. They were floating palaces fitted with lead pipes for running water, heated baths, mosaic floors, marble columns, and bronze fittings of extraordinary craftsmanship. The larger ship was approximately 70 meters long. They were among the most sophisticated vessels the ancient world had ever produced. After the assassination, they were scuttled, deliberately sunk, sent to the bottom of the lake where they rested in the cold, dark water for nearly 2,000 years. In the 1930s, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini ordered Lake Nemi partially drained to recover the ships. He saw them as symbols of Roman engineering genius, proof of the imperial greatness he was trying to resurrect. The ships were raised. They were placed in a purpose-built museum on the lakeshore. They were displayed for the public. And in 1944, during the final stages of the Second World War, the museum was destroyed. Whether by Allied bombing, German arson, or local looters, the ships burned. Caligula's ships were erased twice. Once by Rome, once by war, 2,000 years apart. The erasure was never complete. It was never meant to be complete. It was a performance of forgetting performed by people who could not actually forget. We are releasing documentaries like this regularly, and if you are enjoying this level of depth and detail, there is a simple way to make sure the algorithm keeps showing our work to you. Hit the like button right now. It takes 1 second. It changes what this channel can do. Now, let me tell you about the ghost in the garden. The emperor, who had declared himself a god, received a funeral that would have shamed a freedman. Suetonius records the details. Caligula's body was secretly conveyed from the Cryptoporticus to the Horti Lamiani, the gardens of Lamia, an imperial estate on the Esquiline Hill. The key word is secretly. This was not a state funeral. This was not even a private funeral of the kind afforded to disgraced nobles. This was a disposal. A pyre was constructed. Suetonius calls it a tumultuario rogo, a hasty pyre, built fast, built without ceremony, built by men who wanted this finished before sunrise. The body was placed on it. The fire was lit. And the fire failed. The body was only half burned, semiumbustum, Suetonius writes, half consumed. The pyre was not hot enough, or not large enough, or not given sufficient time to complete its work. What remained of the emperor who had dressed as Jupiter and threatened the king of the gods was pulled from the dying flames and buried under a thin layer of turf. Levi cuspito brutum, covered with light soil. Not interred in the mausoleum of Augustus, where every legitimate member of the dynasty had been placed, not given a marble urn or a eulogy or a procession, dumped in a garden under a scattering of earth so thin that a hard rain would have uncovered it. King Herod Agrippa may have arranged the initial disposal. He was the only person in Rome with both the motive and the access, a friend of the dead man who also needed the new emperor's favor. Getting the body out of the palace and into the ground quickly served everyone's interests, especially Claudius's, who did not want a public funeral that might become a focal point for either mourning or celebration. And then the garden began to speak. Suetonius, who had access to the imperial archives and who wrote with the tone of a man who collected facts the way other men collected coins, records what happened next with a precision that suggests he believed it. Or at least believed that the people who reported it believed it. The caretakers of the Horti Lamiani, the gardeners, the groundskeepers, the slaves who maintained the paths and hedges and fountains of the estate reported disturbances. Suetonius uses the word umbris, shades, shadows of the dead. The caretakers said they were inquietatos, disturbed, unsettled, made restless by the presence of these shades in the garden. And in the house where the assassination had taken place, whether this was the Cryptoporticus itself or a building adjacent to it, not a night passed without some fearsome apparition. The house was eventually destroyed by fire. Suetonius does not say who set the fire or whether it was deliberate. He records only that the fire happened and that the disturbances continued in the garden until the body was properly dealt with. The body was properly dealt with by the dead man's sisters. Agrippina the Younger and Julia Livilla had been exiled to the Pontian Islands by Caligula himself, banished after they were accused of involvement in a plot against him. Claudius, in one of his first acts as emperor, recalled them. They returned to Rome. And one of the first things they did was go to the Horti Lamiani, exhume their brother's half-burned remains, complete the cremation properly, and enter the ashes. The sources do not specify where the ashes were placed, but the most likely location is the mausoleum of Augustus, the great circular tomb on the Campus Martius, where every member of the dynasty since Augustus himself had been laid to rest. If so, Caligula's ashes joined those of his father Germanicus, his mother Agrippina, the elder, and his brothers, all of whom had been placed there before him. The family that Rome had spent 2 decades destroying was reunited in death in the only place that would have them. After the proper burial, Suetonius notes, the disturbances in the garden stopped. But the sisters' own fates tell the final chapter of the Germanicus bloodline, and it is the cruelest chapter of all. Julia Livilla, recalled from exile by Claudius. Given a few months of freedom in Rome, then re-exiled this time on charges of adultery with the philosopher Seneca, charges manufactured by Claudius's wife Messalina, who saw Julia Livilla as a rival for influence. Julia Livilla was sent to an island. She was starved to death. She was 24 years old. The same fate as her mother, Agrippina, the elder. Exile, starvation, an island. 20 years apart, mother and daughter died, the same way, in the same kind of place, by the same method. The Roman machine that had consumed the mother consumed the daughter with the precision of a system that had perfected its technique. Agrippina, the younger, survived. She was smarter. She was more ruthless. She had watched her mother die, her brothers die, her brother emperor die, her sister die, and she had drawn the only conclusion available to a woman of her intelligence and her position. She married Claudius. She married the man who had been found behind the curtain. She became empress. She maneuvered her son from a previous marriage, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, into position as Claudius's heir. She had the boy adopted and renamed. The new name was Nero. In the year 59, 18 years after the assassination in the Cryptoporticus, the Emperor Nero ordered his mother, Agrippina, murdered. She was Germanicus's daughter, Caligula's sister, the last direct descendant of Rome's golden prince who still carried political power. When the assassins came for her, she bared her stomach and told them to strike the womb that had produced Nero. Every member of Germanicus's bloodline was eventually destroyed by Rome. The father was poisoned, the mother was starved, the brothers were locked in dungeons, Caligula was stabbed 30 times, his wife and baby were slaughtered, his sister Julia Livilla was starved, his sister Agrippina was stabbed on the orders of her own son. The bloodline of Rome's most beloved prince produced nothing but corpses, but the garden remembered. In the year 2006, construction workers in Rome broke ground on a new building near the Esquiline Hill. What they found beneath the modern street stopped the project. The Horti Lamieni, the same garden where Caligula's half-burned body had been buried under light turf nearly 2,000 years earlier. The excavation that followed ran from 2006 to 2015, and what emerged from the earth was staggering. More than 100,000 ceramic fragments, bones of exotic animals, the remnants of Caligula's menagerie, the same creatures that had roamed the imperial gardens and been sacrificed at his personal shrine. A fresco, shattered into approximately 90,000 individual pieces, dating to between the years 30 and 50 Caligula's exact period. Archaeologists spent years reassembling it, fragment by fragment, like a puzzle painted on crumbling plaster. They found an emperor's private bathhouse, a nymphaeum, an ornamental grotto with fountains and pools, the infrastructure of imperial luxury, buried and forgotten. In 2021, the Museo Ninfeo opened on the site, displaying the recovered artifacts to the public for the first time. And in 2024, they found the pipe. A lead water pipe, a fistula aquaria, the kind of utilitarian infrastructure that carried water from aqueducts to private gardens in every wealthy Roman estate. Stamped into the lead, in letters that had survived 2,000 years of burial and corrosion and neglect, and the collapse of the civilization that created them, was a name. Caligula's name. The Senate had melted his coins. They had recarved his statues. They had chiseled his inscriptions. They had demolished his bridge and dismantled his temples and sunk his ships. They had forbidden his name in oaths and removed it from the calendar and conducted a decade-long campaign to erase every physical trace of his existence from the surface of the Roman world. And a plumber, sometime around the year 38, doing his job, following standard procedure, had stamped the emperor's name on a water pipe and buried it in the garden. Because that was the regulation. You stamped the owner's name on the pipe. That was all. A bureaucratic act, an administrative formality. The most mundane, invisible, forgettable piece of infrastructure in the entire Roman Empire. And it survived everything. The statues were recarved. The pipe endured. The coins were melted. The pipe endured. The inscriptions were chiseled. The buildings were demolished. The ships were sunk and razed and burned. The empire itself fell. And the pipe endured. They could not erase a pipe. The most powerful civilization in the history of the ancient world could not erase a water pipe. There is one more thing this story needs. The word mad. Every source that survived from antiquity calls Caligula mad, and the word has followed him for 2,000 years like a shadow he cannot shed. But the madness was not a fact. It was a construction. And it was built slowly, over generations, by men, who each had their own reason to build it. But Seneca knew Caligula personally. He had been in the court. He had watched the emperor at close range, close enough to form a first-hand opinion, and Seneca's opinion was specific. He called Caligula wicked, not insane, not deranged, wicked, a man who chose cruelty because cruelty served his purposes. Suetonius, writing 80 years later, introduced the idea of mental illness. He placed a chapter break in the middle of his biography, everything before this point as emperor, everything after as monster, and he described Caligula's behavior as a sickness, a mentis valetudo. But Suetonius was not a doctor. He was a gossip with archive access. And the chapter break told you more about his literary technique than about Caligula's brain. Dio Cassius, another century later, went further. He stated that Caligula had simply lost his head. And by the time the story reached the poets and the playwrights, and eventually the filmmakers, Caligula had become a single word, a synonym, the emperor, whose name means insanity. Each generation made the story simpler and the emperor crazier, because madness is a convenient explanation. Madness asks nothing of the system that produced the man. If Caligula was mad, then Rome was blameless. If his cruelty was illness, then the empire that created the conditions for that cruelty bears no responsibility. Modern scholars have spent a century trying to reverse the damage. Balston, in 1934, was the first to argue that the ancient sources were unreliable, that the stories had been exaggerated and distorted by men with political motives. Barrett, in 1989, argued that Caligula was immature, not insane, a young man given too much power too fast, reacting to a childhood of sustained trauma. Winterling in 2003 went the furthest. He argued that the madness was invented entirely, that the horse consul was a cruel joke at the Senate's expense, a way of telling the most powerful men in Rome that their position was worth less than an animal's, that the bridge at Baiae was political theater, that the seashells were punishment for mutinous troops, not evidence of insanity. Bad. Not mad. The same conclusion Philo of Alexandria had reached in person, in the room with Caligula, 2,000 years earlier. The sickness did not create the savageness. It merely removed the pretense. But here is the thesis, and it is not the one you expected. It does not matter whether Caligula was mad or bad. What matters is what Rome did. Rome created the conditions that produced him: a murdered father, a starved mother, brothers locked in dungeons, 5 years on a cliff with the man responsible. Then, absolute power, handed to the survivor of all of that trauma, with no preparation, no restraint, and no mechanism for removal, except assassination. Rome was horrified by the result. Rome killed him, killed his wife, killed his baby, half-burned his body, tried to erase his name from every surface in the empire. And failed. Failed because you cannot erase a person by chiseling stone. Failed because the stories people tell about monsters outlast the monuments people build to heroes. Failed because a plumber in the year 38, following regulations, stamped a name on a water pipe and buried it in a garden. And that pipe carried the name into the 21st century when the statues and the coins and the inscriptions could not. You cannot kill a ghost by pretending it never lived. Rome learned that. They are still learning it. We are still telling the story. The boots. The tiny boots from the Rhine. They dressed a toddler for war as a joke. They gave him a nickname that soldiers chanted and senators feared, and emperors tried to delete from every surface in the Roman world. 2,000 years later, that nickname is still the first thing anyone knows about him. Caligula. Little Boot. Even the name they tried to erase was never his name. It was a joke from men who loved a child, and it outlasted the empire that gave it to him. If this story changed how you see the Roman Empire, if it made you look at the word erase and understand that erasure is just another kind of confession, an admission that the thing you are trying to destroy was powerful enough to frighten you, then share this video with one person. Just one. Send it to someone who thinks the powerful can erase whatever they want. They cannot. History always keeps receipts. Subscribe if you have not already, and turn on the notification bell, because the next documentary from this channel is already in production, and the algorithm will not show it to you unless you have told it you want it. You have just watched a premium documentary by Remnant, your ultimate history destination on YouTube. On your screen right now, you should see another documentary from this channel. Click it and keep going. Do not stop here.